We have James Allsup joining us. What's up, James? People were asking for you in the chat.
Hello, guys. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm using my my road setup from an undisclosed location here in the southwestern U.S. So good discussion. I was listening. Good stuff. We did a stream a while ago talking about some of these issues. Basically, I what I was hearing from Shane about immigration, just the whole thing, none of it made sense, man, and none of it was factually accurate. When you want to talk about assimilation, there's polling from National Institute of Health that shows that immigrants identify more strongly, especially Hispanic immigrants still identify strong, and their home country more so than Americans, and that goes first and third generation. We want to talk about a small government. We can look at this study from Pew Research, which finds, and I think we could both agree that neither of the major parties is ideal in any way, but the majority of Democrats, or the majority of libertarians would say, is in effect for larger government more so than the Republicans. And we can look at all Hispanics identify 49% to 10% Democrat Republican. Hispanic registered voters 57% to 14% Democrat over Republican. Native born Hispanics actually identify 53% to 12% compared to foreign born is 45%, 8% stronger identification with the Democratic Party, which means more big government, means more welfare state. Yeah.
Sorry, yo, try turning off your camera. Your internet's lagging a little bit, and it'll probably save on bandwidth. If you just go voice,
okay. Can you hear me?
Should be a lot better. Yeah.
And your picture with an American flag is so much more Chad.
It's better optics. Yeah, it's better optics.
Yeah.
Everything I just said. Okay, yeah, I'm using my phone as a hotspot, and then illegal immigrant versus legal immigrant doesn't really matter. I mean, the numbers are effectively the same whether they came in legally or illegally with their party identification. There's another study from Pew Research I don't have in front of me, but it shows that by racial group, whites are the only group that prefers smaller government over big government, which finds it 70% of Hispanics and blacks both believe in restriction of speech that offends racial minorities. We can look at polling on the, I don't know, just say first or second, but it's the same for the first and second amendment. Those are separate polls. One of them is by, I believe, Pew, and the other one is from another source I could pull up. But on every issue, if you want to talk about creating open borders, will not get you there. Because open borders creates a magnet for people from the third world to come into your country. And as long as we have democracy, these people will vote for bigger government and less rights for the individual. And if that's what you're concerned with, you should be proposing, if anything, a European-only immigration.
Well, I'm just going to quickly reiterate that all of my sources are over at my video, How to Argue for Immigration Restrictions, and the listeners can check out your sources and check out my sources and see which one they think is.
But without talking about the source,
right? But I mean, you don't actually believe that immigrants coming to this country, by and large, want less government, do you?
Oh no, I never claimed that.
Okay,
and you recognize that they vote in such a way so as to expand the government. Yeah.
Well, no, because again, you have to be a citizen to vote.
Yeah, they're children.
Okay, well,
right, but they're children of citizens.
Well, that's not even true though. That's not even totally true. And B, they either become citizens or they get birthright citizenship. If they're in the country for a long enough time, they're going to become citizens.
Now we're talking about there's a difference between immigration and naturalization. And if you want to put, say, okay, before we naturalize someone and give them the right to vote and things like that, we need to do all this other stuff. That I can get behind. I can get behind that.
Sure, but if they're here for a long enough time, they're going to start voting. Either they're going to be a citizen or they're going to be in a state where they just don't require you to be a citizen, right? Like California, I think that's where this sort of thinking leads.
So. Is anybody here opposed to more restrictions on voting?
Say that again. You cut out.
I was just asking: is anybody here opposed to imposing more restrictions on the right to vote?
Oh, I'm a big fan on raising the voting age. I would be a bit concerned about things like you have to own property or have to have a certain amount of wealth, because that could be used to, for certain groups to control how you get those criteria. Like if you have to own a certain amount of land, like a bunch of people could do things to prevent other people from getting land, to prevent them from voting. But an age restriction, raising the voting age, I think would be better.
But the contrary to what you just said there, I'll type, and I'm not saying I agree with this, but there is the case that, you know, if the more property you own and the more taxes you pay, you know, you have the right to vote, because otherwise you get a lot of people voting who don't pay those taxes, and they can just vote themselves largesse from the treasury, I believe is how it was said back in the founding of our country. So, and there's that flip side of it too.
Yeah.
Right. There have been a lot of experiments.
I think the danger. I think
it's interesting you mentioned that though.
Okay, so
traders. Sorry.
There have been a large
wealth.
Yeah, we have to find
wealth
like
arbiter.
Yeah. All right. So James, you can go first, and then we'll go in line because it gets a little messy. But go ahead, James.
Okay. Yeah. So that's an interesting supposition that wealth is what is going to be the major determinant of how people vote, because what actually we find is that race is a much stronger corollary for people's ideology and how they perform in the voting booth. I mean, you can look at poor whites, for example, vote conservatively and vote for smaller government much more than even wealthy blacks or wealthy Hispanics or wealthy Asians. And so, again, if we are concerned with small government and concerned with individual liberty under the current confines, unless we want to talk about, you know, abolition of voting or something radical like that, under the current confines, an open border system like you've proposed, Shane, would actually lead to necessarily a larger government and a larger importation of people who are going to vote for an even larger government. It'll be a self-perpetuating system.
But I mean, that sounds kind of dangerously close to, I only want to allow people to vote if they agree with me. And, you know, I don't think any of us want that.
Huh? No, I want that. I want that.
Yeah,
I want that.
Look,
I want
the left.
But you see, that's why I think.
Why don't we?
But you see, that's why I think the market-based approach works better, because, you know, the more skin you have in the game, the more incentive you have, you know, to work for it for self-interest. Whereas with the political system, you have people, you know, conned basically into voting against their self-interests all the time. I mean, they're told that things like, you know, minimum wage are great for them because they'll get paid more when they want. They'll lose their jobs, you know?
Yeah, but one thing that it's important to note, which James was saying, but to reiterate, is that oftentimes people vote not in terms of even their perceived self-interest, but rather their perceived group interest. And not only is it true that high SES non-whites still vote Democrat, but amazingly, when I first saw this, I was very skeptical of this. I went and rechecked the numbers in the General Social Survey myself, but it is true that self-identified conservative blacks and Hispanics on net vote Democrat. It's an extraordinary thing, the degree to which race predicts voting in the United States. Also, though, in terms of restricting voting, I think it's worth noting that there have been a large number of experiments throughout history, especially in the 20th century, of 20th and 19th century, of attempting to disenfranchise groups. And what we see is that if they're there in large numbers and for a long time, what ends up happening, and we've seen this all over the world, is that they get very mad, political instability occurs, and eventually they get the right to vote and often end up dominating the society.
But you see, that's why, you know, I'll reiterate that this isn't really something that, you know, you can look at in a vacuum. If the problem is with this issue of welfare, then let's take care of the welfare issue. If the problem, you know, it is with, you know, the criteria for who should be allowed to vote, then let's take care of it from that end.
Okay, but if most Hispanics want a larger government and you let the population become majority Hispanic, even if while you're doing that, you get rid of the welfare state, as soon as they become the majority of voters, assuming that they vote in people who enact what they want, you're going to get the welfare state again.
But
again, how is that different with any other system ever?
Because an ethno state wouldn't let such people in, or it shouldn't.
But wouldn't it make sense though if the end goal is trying to allow, you know, racial demographics to have more sovereignty in terms of their voting patterns as it correlates with the influence on their own lives? Wouldn't it be better served, instead of trying to I guess make democracy homogenous, wouldn't it be better served to decentralize democracy and allow certain, I guess go back to the states' rights model, and not necessarily not necessarily in contrast with I guess immigration restrictions. I guess you could couple those, but in conjunction with it, wouldn't it also be beneficial to the end goal of the ethno state, I guess, to want.
Yeah, I think that if states want to enact immigration controls on top of what the federal government has done, that's certainly a fine thing. And more even than that, if residential areas want to apply standards for who can move in based on so-called protected classes, that's fine as well. So yeah, like those things can go together, and they should go together.
Yeah, and
I mean, that's
and also restrictive covenants is actually something that has a lot of legal precedent in the United States. So it's not something that's like way out of left field to do. We have a long history of that, and all we need is a few court cases or a few interpretations to put that back in place.
I do want to say though,
I can get behind. Yeah, that's something I can get behind. Like if a gated community or something wanted to do that, or something else like that. I just see my thing is it's all about the private property. You don't get to tell someone else what to do with their property. You don't get to say to a businessman, you can't hire this person because he's an immigrant. You can't say to a landlord, you can't rent to this person, because he's an immigrant. If you want to form, covenants or gated communities or whatever to do that and do it voluntarily, that's fine. But I mean, if you're going to
the private political order. In the current political order, Shane, this is the reality. There is a state. The state is being maintained and grown by minorities. The fact that there's a guy with a skeleton avatar that thinks that freedom is great is not enough to combat the forces of democracy that are applying to you. What will you do with this problem?
Well, okay. First of all, I would say that I did ask this question earlier. You all said that everything we're talking about does apply to Ancapistan as well. So when you're talking about there is a state now, I kind of feel like we're jumping around. I mean, as far as what should happen now, I mean, what's happening now is so crazy. I don't really have much of an idea where you should begin. I probably wouldn't start with, tearing down all of the immigration restrictions and going towards open borders. I probably start with things like the welfare state. But I mean, just how I would approach this situation here and dismantling what we have, isn't the same thing as arguing the principle, which is what I've been doing.
But the thing about I think that, but the thing with the principle though, like private property is always contextual, and the criteria for land ownership, it's based on some sort of agreed norms of that. So when you're talking about, you talk about, what I care about is private property, but private property is legally enforced by either what we would call a state or some sort of enforcement agency, and ultimately private property has to be enforced by the barrel of a gun. And you say, and these are not self-evident principles. This is all constructed.
And could I, if you don't mind, could I field that question from JF as well? Which I guess to reiterate. Well,
yep.
I think most people heard it. Like, what would be the ANCAP proposal of what to do now in terms of what we currently face? My personal idea is to, I guess, promote discrimination and secession to as far an extent as possible, without causing major unrest. And in contrast with that, when people protest that, which they inevitably will, with calls for egalitarianism and universalism, then to inject the discussion of secession as an alternative to seek justice from an illegitimate system, which they think which would be the state. So I guess using the state, making the state not appear as a good thing in the eyes of the populace, using it to promote discrimination, which correlates with preserving, pro-liberty demographics at the moment, while we're working to change the cultural attitudes of the, the population.
But I would give the same answer to you as I would to Shane. Shane is saying we should, your solution, Shane, was getting rid of the welfare, but the welfare is there for a reason. It's because it's being maintained by democratic vote, and there's no solution other than persuasion. And persuasion doesn't seem to work. The libertarian ideas have been there for decades now. It will not convince minorities in this country. So we are headed toward a democratic growth of the state, that there is no other solution than a voluntary persuasion that we know will not operate. Unless that guy, you disagree with me, you think you will convince enough people to balance the democratic vote?
No, not at all. But I do think there are certain innovative structures that can be utilized to, I guess, combat welfarism. One being cryptocurrency. I know it's pretty far off right now, but I think getting to a point to where we can have a means of exchange that can't be sanctioned by the government is a good way to combat welfarism.
So you're advocating for a form of withdrawal from the current society through any means, including cryptocurrency. So the development of a kind of parallel economy that is not subject to state control.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Can I ask that guy, T? So what I'm looking, it seems to me what you're looking at is sort of a, like, not necessarily like an ANCAP victory, but it seems to me that you're looking at almost like a pan-separatist sort of thing, that basically trying to promote any kind of separatism from the United States, by any means possible. So
I think that's synonymous with an ANCAP victory.
Yeah, and so, but the thing is, so you're sort of saying, hey, let's promote, for example, all sorts of statists that want to break off from the United States. Because I'm looking at, for example, things look a lot better when you look at, say, how many people want to break off from the United States. There was a recent poll in California that had it over 30%. Texas was, I think, under Obama. It's gone down because of Trump, but under Obama, it was like around 34%. So these are big numbers of people who not only support the idea of a state seceding, but specifically want their state to break off from the U.S. So I think that if you're looking at it, in those ways, that in terms of like some sort of pan-separatist movement, and if you can find a way to harness the energy of people who want to break off from the U.S. for any reason, that that a lot of radical ideas become a lot more plausible.
And not only in terms of people breaking off from the U.S., but also the U.S. breaking people off from itself. For example, this is one that I've been in disagreement with a lot of libertarians with, but Trump's recent transgender ban. A lot of people are saying, it's anti-libertarian. We shouldn't be, injecting identity politics into this. Anybody should have the right to serve their nation, especially if they're paying taxes. I disagree. I think the state, as an entity, has every right to impose discrimination and sanction against other individuals. The main thing I think makes the state illegitimate as a concept is the fact that it doesn't allow individuals to secede from it. Not that it imposes discrimination. I don't think that's an illegitimate practice at all. I think that's morally, congruent with any libertarian philosophy. But when the state demands that you don't have the right to secede from it, whether it be, in terms of welfare or whatever, or also in terms of being able to protect your own private community, how you see fit from its universal application, kind of like in Europe right now, where they say, you don't have the right to own guns. You don't have the right to, impose renters restrictions or things like that on certain people. I think that's what makes the state illegitimate. And that's why, I guess nobody asked, but I guess that's why I conclude myself as an ANCAP.
Can I jump in with an additional point to that? Because I'm as much for secession as everyone else, but I mean, even if you don't have enough people to actually secede, to break your state off from the United States, the 10th Amendment gives states a right known as nullification, which means that if they disagree with what the federal government's doing, they can't actively obstruct it, but they can say, well, we're not going to go along with this. We're not going to cooperate with the things you want to do in our state. And I mean, it's not a full-on secession, but I mean, it has been employed in the past to a lot of good use. So, I mean, that's at least kind of a partial stage along the way to it.